Hi, I'm Andy Thompson. I teach ethics and theology at the School of Theology at the University of the South, or Sewanee. And I'm so pleased to have this opportunity to speak with the Episcopal Churchmen of Tennessee. And I'm especially excited about the theme that you've chosen, to love and serve you with gladness and singleness of heart. Because that line, particularly the gladness and singleness of heart, has always called my attention as such a compelling reflection on the Christian life and on Christian morality. And I'm excited to think in particular about its meaning for us today in an especially complicated time and in relation to my area of specialization, which is creation care and environmental theology. And so my focus for today is gladness and singleness of heart, unity in a fractured time. I think particularly in the time that we're in now, that theme, especially singleness, the idea of singleness of heart, seems really important. And I'm calling this a fractured time. I mean this in a variety of ways. I think we're divided from one another politically around the issues of the virus, but also around racism, the economy, political issues. Certainly environmental issues are a part of that. I think we feel separated from one another by social distancing and by quarantine. We may also feel divided by race, class, gender, and sexuality. And so I think we're experiencing these fractures, and I think there are ways that we're experiencing those internally, personally as well. I think the Christian life often feels divided, drawn by different commitments, and maybe now even more than usual. Commitments to social justice, to evangelism, to creation care, commitments to our family, to our loved ones, especially at this difficult time, to our worship community, commitments to our own personal faith and piety. So in this context, I think the statement to love and serve with gladness and singleness of heart speaks to us as a call, as a challenge. We're called in this fractured time to be a witness of unity, a witness of singleness of heart with one another and singleness of heart within ourselves. And this fractured time, this dividedness, this is not just a coincidence. This is not just an unfortunate thing. To a certain extent, this is something that's cultivated. This is something that's created by social forces, what the Bible calls powers and principalities, that actively work to divide us from one another and to divide our attentions, to keep us from seeking more justice, from seeking the kingdom of God by keeping us divided. And in that context, Christian unity is an incredibly powerful witness. And so what I want to address today is what that unity looks like, both in terms of Christian commitments and commitments to social issues, and specifically with the Church's three priorities, the Episcopal Church's three priorities of racial reconciliation, care of creation, and evangelism. How those three things that may seem like completely separate emphases, separate commitments, how those in fact are more unified than we may think. So that's on the one hand, the unity of those Christian commitments. On the other hand, or in the second part of this talk, I want to discuss unity within the Christian moral life, what it means to live a unified life in the face of these what seem to be diverse commitments, maybe to those three, racial reconciliation, care of creation, and evangelism, or to any of the other diverse commitments that we feel, the different calls that we may feel. And so I'd like to begin with those three priorities: care of creation, racial reconciliation, and evangelism, the three priorities that Presiding Bishop Michael Curry has established for the Episcopal Church. And I think it's easy to see why those are important, why those are priorities for the Church. It may be harder to see what they have to do with one another, how they might be unified, and in the terms of the theme of this conference, how we might seek to pursue those goals with gladness and singleness of heart. What does creation care have to do with evangelism, with racial reconciliation? To address that, I want to tell a few short stories. For nearly 2 weeks, in July and August of 1978, a black tanker truck drove down the highways in the middle of the night, each night. The truck, owned by the Ward Transformer Company, deliberately dripped 31,000 gallons of oil contaminated with polychlorinated biphenyl, or BCP. It spread that oil over 200 miles of highway in 14 counties. When that pollution was discovered, the state put up warning signs and made plans for a landfill in Warren County, North Carolina, a primarily African American county, over the protests of its residents. Then in 1982, when the state prepared to haul in 10,000 truckloads to that landfill, hundreds of protesters, led by the United Church of Christ pastor Benjamin Chavis, lay down in the truck's path. The protest lasted 6 weeks and led to more than 500 arrests. The protesters failed to stop the landfill, which, unsurprisingly, failed and dangerously polluted the air and the water. But they launched what became known as the environmental justice movement, waves of grassroots activism against environmental inequalities. And they also introduced the idea of environmental racism. Environmental racism refers to any policy, practice, or directive that differentially affects or disadvantages, whether intended or unintended, individuals, groups, or communities based on race or color. That's the official definition of that. And this was particularly documented by a report by the United Church of Christ in 1987, again under the leadership of Benjamin Chavis. They released this report called Toxic Waste and Race that showed that race is the #1 factor that determined which communities hosted toxic waste facilities, more than income, more than home value, race. 3 out of 5 Black and Hispanic Americans lived in a community that housed what the EPA called an uncontrolled toxic waste site. So that documented environmental racism as an actual fact. And remember, as the definition explains, it doesn't necessarily have to be intentional. Someone saying, we'll cite this here because people of color live here. But rather, any policy that disproportionately affects, a policy or action that disproportionately affects people and communities of color in that way. So this was a documented fact back in 1987. In 2007, the UCC revisited its report, and with better methodology, it confirmed the original finding, that race continues to be an important independent predictor of where hazardous wastes are located, and a stronger predictor than income, education, and other socioeconomic indicators. And in fact, they showed that the Environmental Protection Agency, rather than addressing this problem that they had documented 20 years earlier, was actually attacking the principles of environmental justice and making the problem worse. We can think of lots of other examples of this, starting back in the late 70s in Warren County, and coming up to recent news. I think all of us are familiar with the Dakota Access Pipeline in Standing Rock, or with the water situation in Flint, Michigan. Those two are examples of environmental harms disproportionately affecting communities of color. So in that context, priority of racial reconciliation that the church has set out demands environmental justice. It demands that we attend to the environmental harms that our society is creating that are affecting communities of color disproportionately. And it might demand something like environmental reparations, like deliberate attempts to address the wrongs that have been done and are still being done by environmental racism. Another area where this is relevant is with respect to indigenous communities. I think we know that all of the land that we live on, that white people live on, and that our churches sit on, and that we worship and pray and conduct our lives on, all of that land was taken more or less unjustly from the indigenous communities that live here. And so something like environmental reparations may be called for in that context as well. And around the world, land is still being forcibly taken from indigenous communities. One of the starkest examples is in the Amazon. You all may remember the recent fires in the Amazon that were the subject of a lot of news. And that's one of the ways that people are taking land from the indigenous communities by burning it and then converting it into ranches or farmland. That leads to another related area of environmental justice, which is climate change. It is a documented fact that climate change is already and will continue to affect disproportionately communities of color all around the world, and especially indigenous communities. And those communities have been speaking out in environmental climate change negotiations to try to have more representation, more of a voice in thinking about how to address these things that are going to affect them so immediately. I had the privilege of being able to attend the Conference of Parties, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, a couple years back, and one of the most striking things was the powerful witness from indigenous communities, especially from the Amazon, not only about the injustices that they were suffering, but about what a powerful witness they could offer and how they had solutions. They offered a different way of relating to the land. And what those communities called for, and what this combination of racial reconciliation with environmental justice and creation care calls for, is a more holistic vision of justice, a more comprehensive vision of what a just society looks like, one that addresses environmental inequalities alongside of social and economic and racial inequalities and political inequalities as well. A great example of that kind of comprehensive vision of justice historically right here on the Cumberland Plateau, just a few miles away from Sewanee, where the Highlander Folk School trained civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, Rosa Parks, and also led environmental justice movements here locally in Tennessee and trained leaders for those movements in other places as well. So that was a vision of social, economic, political, and environmental justice working together. A more contemporary vision is the Poor People's Campaign, that actually is a continuation of Martin Luther King's vision towards the end of his life, that racial justice demanded economic justice. And today, the Poor People's Campaign, led by Liz Theo-Harris and William Barber, brings together economic, social, and racial issues as well as environmental issues, because it recognizes that all of these things are part of one coherent vision, cohesive, comprehensive vision of justice. And that's what I think the three priorities that we have in the Episcopal Church call us to. So to return to those three priorities, I've spoken of racial reconciliation and environmental justice or care of creation. What do those have to do with evangelism? What do those have to do with proclaiming the gospel? Well, I would argue that in this world of intersecting injustices, proclaiming the gospel requires a comprehensive vision of justice and requires that we work to address all forms of injustice in the economy, in healthcare, in the environment, across race, gender, sexuality, and income. The theological term that we have to help us think about this is the biblical term of the powers and principalities. The Bible speaks of powers and principalities and that Jesus is Lord over them. This term, we can understand it to refer to those institutions and systems that dominate and control our life together and are not necessarily under our control. Environmental racism, climate change, and the political and economic systems that support those can be understood as powers and principalities. And so if we insist that Jesus is Lord over them, then that means that they ought to serve Jesus. They ought to be life-giving and transformed into life-giving, life-fulfilling institutions, moving us towards God's kingdom, towards a more just society. Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, says that the reason for all Christian moral decisions must be, quote, the vision of a living Lord whose glory I must strive to make visible. If that's what evangelism is, making the glory of the living Lord visible, the Lord who is Lord over the powers and principalities, then that's where we find this singleness of heart, in this comprehensive vision of Christ's lordship over anything that distorts life and towards a more life-giving society, towards greater justice, towards something closer to God's kingdom, or as the presiding bishop, Michael Curry, talks about, God's dream. And so now I want to talk about another kind of fracture that we may be feeling. Given this comprehensive vision of justice, of Christ's lordship over the powers and principalities, how do we orient our lives towards that? How do we orient our lives towards this comprehensive vision? As I noted, another kind of fracturedness we may be experiencing right now is in our moral lives and our faith lives. We may feel conflicting calls, and this may be something that we experience frequently, but I believe it may be even more pronounced right now. Calls to care for our loved ones and our family, of course, at this difficult time. Calls to support our community, to care for ourselves, which is so important, and to work for justice, to work against the kinds of injustices we've been talking about. And at the same time that we experiencing these different calls, we're barraged by a constant stream of news stories and social media, which often is very ugly. We may feel scattered, inattentive, and anxious at best. So in that context, how can we begin to think about what we ought to do in this context of conflict and tension, of competing calls on us? The Episcopal ethicist Timothy Sedgwick writes of the Christian moral life and a vision of Christ's kingdom in terms of a covenant of hospitality. God's love for the whole creation, incarnate in creation, and love that humans live out in reconciliation and justice. Sedgwick speaks of practices of piety, things like meditation, prayer, contemplation, simplicity of life, and action that lead to this life of reconciliation and justice. And Sedgwick names 3 characteristics, especially for Anglican theology, characteristics of the life of Christian faith. It's incarnate, that is, it's enfleshed in the world that we live in. It's corporate, that is, it can only be practiced in a community with other people. And it's sacramental, that is, it's expressed in signs and symbols that represent and present God's love to us. But these are precisely the characteristics of the life of faith that are most challenged right now, that are perhaps least accessible right now. Most of our interactions are like this. This is not, or does not feel incarnate to communicate with one another through the internet. It is, and our ability to gather, to be a collective body, to be a community is challenged by this. Certainly, this technology has made things possible that we couldn't have imagined decades ago, but it still doesn't feel like the kind of community that we're used to. And finally, sacraments. I think many of us are experiencing the loss of the sacraments of the church, loss of the opportunity to partake of Eucharist and baptism and confession and the other sacraments that the church recognizes. And so here I want to suggest that this is another area where attention to creation, to the created world around us, might be able to help us. So incarnation, for example. Certainly we think of Christ with the incarnation, and we think of the incarnation of God in other people. But this creation that surrounds us is also an incarnation of God. It is also a physical manifestation of God in this world. And so we can experience incarnation even when we can't be surrounded by people that we love or in the presence of other people in church. We can experience the incarnation here in the created world. Likewise, the sacraments. We tend to think of the sacraments narrowly as either the 2 sacraments of baptism and Eucharist, or the 7 sacraments that the Episcopal Church calls sacramental rites. And those are important and those are unique. And we can think of sacraments more broadly too. We can be recalled to our baptism when we touch the water of a stream. We can think of the sacrament of breath, the Holy Spirit as a presence in the world that we can breathe in, that we can inspire. We can think of meals as sacramental. We can think of God's presence in an ordinary meal, in an ordinary piece of bread, even when we can't be present at the altar. And so we can find that sacramentality too in the world around us. And in a similar way, we can expand our understanding of community to include not just those loved ones who we may be with or the loved ones who we may be missing, but the non-human community that surrounds us, the created world that is all around us. And I think the more that we can experience that corporate aspect of our faith with the non-human world in addition to the human world, and certainly not as a replacement, the more we'll be able to access those distinctive characteristics of the life of faith that Sedgwick talks about. So to try to bring this together, again, to speak of unity, to try to bring these 2 different threads that I've been addressing together, what I'm trying to say is something that many of you may have already experienced in this time, which is in this fractured time when unity seems so difficult to find. We may find something of the unity we're looking for if we attend more closely to the created world, to the world around us. Connection with the natural world can help us cultivate the kind of practices that Sedgwick is talking about: incarnational, sacramental, and communal practices of contemplation and prayer, practices of simplicity of life, and practices of action, especially in a time when our usual forms of those characteristics, our attendance at church, the presence of other people, may be harder for us to access. The created world may provide opportunities for those kinds of practices. And those, as Sedgwick argues, can shape us for a moral life of hospitality, which, as he insists, is a life of reconciliation and justice. And that moral life, that vision of a moral life, has a lot in common with the comprehensive vision that I described and that I think Rowan Williams names. The vision of a living Lord whose glory I must strive to make visible. A Lord who is Lord over the powers and principalities, who is Lord over anything that sows distortion and division that divides us in this fractured time. And a witness, a powerful Christian witness for unity and against all sorts of injustice and division. But that witness is empty if it's not grounded in the practices of prayer and piety that I'm suggesting we can encounter, particularly in the created world around us. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your attendance at this conference, and I look forward to our continued discussion. Thank you very much.